gentle chime of the grandfather clock in the corner marked the passing of another hour, its steady rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the crackling fire in the hearth. I sat in the familiar, overstuffed armchair in my parents' living room, a room that seemed to have resisted the passage of time, remaining as I always remembered it from my childhood. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled to the brim with worn spines and family photographs, each capturing a moment frozen in time. It was a rare occasion. This family gathering, work and life had a way of creating distance, not just in miles, but in shared moments. But here, in this room, time seemed to pause, allowing for a breath, a moment to reminisce. My parents sat across from me, my father's hair grayer than I remembered, his eyes still bright with the same intelligent humor. My mother, ever the heart of our family, wore her age with grace, her smile lines deepening as she recounted stories of my childhood escapades. As the evening wore on, the conversation meandered through various topics, from trivial family matters to the more profound changes in our lives. The glow from the fireplace cast a warm, flickering light across the room, creating a cozy, almost ethereal atmosphere. It was during one of these stories, a seemingly innocuous memory of a family hiking trip we took when I was about 10, that the mood subtly shifted. I had always held this particular memory close to my heart. It was an adventure in the deep woods, filled with the excitement of discovery and the warmth of family bonding. I remembered the laughter, the smell of the damp earth, and the way the sunlight dappled through the dense canopy above. But as my parents exchanged glances, an unspoken communication passing between them, I sensed there was more to this story, a depth I had never known. That day in the woods, my dad began, his voice taking on a serious tone that immediately captured my attention. It was a tone I had rarely heard from him, one that spoke of gravity and perhaps a touch of sorrow. My mom reached over, taking my dad's hand in hers, a gesture of support. She nodded at him, encouraging him to continue. I leaned forward, setting my tea down on the coffee table. This was no longer just a trip down memory lane. This was a revelation, a peeling back of a layer of my childhood that I never knew was veiled in mystery. "We never intended to keep this from you," my mom said, softly, her eyes meeting mine. But at the time, it seemed like the right thing to do. I was silent, my mind racing, trying to piece together what could have been so significant about that day, something that warranted such a serious tone now. As the story unfolded, what I had always remembered as a simple, joyful family outing in the woods began to morph into something else entirely, something darker and more complex. I realized that there were shadows in those woods that my childhood self had never seen, echoes of a truth that had been kept from me until now. As my parents began to unravel the story, the room around me seemed to fade, giving way to the vivid memory of that summer day years ago. I was 10 years old, filled with the boundless energy and curiosity of youth. My sister, Jody, 2 years my junior, was my constant companion in adventure. Her laughter, a frequent soundtrack to our escapades. The forest, with its towering trees and hidden trails, had been our playground. That day, as our family embarked on a hiking trip, the air was alive with the promise of discovery. The sun filtered through the leaves in golden shafts, casting a magical glow on the path ahead. We walked for hours, my parents leading the way. I remember watching my dad point out different types of trees and animal tracks, his knowledge of the wilderness a source of awe for me. My mom would occasionally chime in with stories or jokes, keeping the mood light and cheerful. Jody and I would race ahead, playing hide and seek among the trees, our laughter echoing through the woods. The sense of freedom was exhilarating. The forest felt like a world away from the constraints of our regular life. It was during one of these games that I first sensed something amiss. I had hidden behind a large oak tree, waiting for Jody to find me, when a sudden stillness enveloped the woods. The birds had stopped singing, and there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't understand. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my imagination, but the feeling lingered. As we regrouped with our parents for lunch, I noticed a subtle change in their demeanor. They were quieter, more reserved, and there were moments when they seemed to be communicating silently with each other, their expressions tinged with concern. After lunch, we continued our hike, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was an unspoken tension, a sense that we were no longer alone in the forest. I remember hearing distant sounds that didn't fit, a muffled thud, the crack of a branch, and seeing my dad's head snap up, his eyes scanning the surroundings with an intensity I had never seen before. The deeper we ventured, the more frequent these unsettling moments became. Jody clung closer to our mom, her earlier exuberance dampened by the growing unease. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the beauty of the forest, but it was like a shadow had fallen over our day. The climax of that trip was a moment that had seemed innocuous to my child's mind, but now took on a sinister tone in my memory. We had stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin, its windows broken, the door hanging off its hinges. I had been fascinated, eager to explore, but my parents hurried us away, their faces etched with worry. It was only later, as we hastily made our way back to the car, that I heard the distant sound that I had forgotten until now. A sound that, in the innocence of childhood, I had mistaken for hunters in the woods. But as my dad's voice, from the present, interjected into my memory, I realized what it truly was. "Those were gunshots, son," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of a long-kept secret. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Gunshots, in the serenity of those woods. My adult mind reeled at the implications, but in my memory, I was still that 10-year-old boy, oblivious to the danger, oblivious to the danger. My father's voice brought me back to the living room, but my mind lingered in the forest of my memories. "We thought it was a hunter at first," he said, his eyes distant, as if he too was reliving that day. But then we heard more shots, closer, and it wasn't just hunting. Something was wrong. I could see it now, through the eyes of my parents. The worry that had creased their brows wasn't just the usual concern of parents on a family outing. It was fear, real, palpable fear. We decided to turn back, to get out of the woods as quickly as possible, my mom continued. Her voice was steady, but her hands were tightly clasped, knuckles white. "We didn't want to scare you, or Jody. We thought if we acted normal, you wouldn't notice." But we had noticed, hadn't we? Jody clinging to Mom, the way our laughter had died down, the tense set of Dad's shoulders as he led us briskly back the way we came. And then my dad said, "We saw the police." The memory hit me anew. I remembered the sudden appearance of uniformed officers, their faces grim and serious. They had told us the area was unsafe, that we needed to leave immediately. I remembered being confused, scared by their urgency, the way they looked at each other when they thought we weren't watching. "We heard bits and pieces from them," my mom said. "A man, a cabin, something about a family." A tragedy. The pieces fell into place, a jigsaw of horror forming a picture I had never seen. I remembered the hurried drive home, the radio turned off, the hushed conversation between my parents when they thought Jody and I were asleep. The room was silent for a long moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound. I looked at my parents, seeing them not just as my caregivers, but as people who had faced a nightmare and had tried to shield their children from it. "But why didn't you ever tell me?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "We thought it was best to let it be," my dad answered, "to let you keep your happy memories of that day." "But it was a lie," I said, the weight of the truth heavy in my chest. "It was a protection," my mom corrected gently. "You were a child, son. We wanted you to stay that way as long as you could." I leaned back, the story settling around me like a cloak. I had lived for years with a memory that was a mere shadow of the truth. And yet, I couldn't fault my parents for their decision. They had faced an impossible situation, trying to protect their children from a reality too harsh for young minds. The fire crackled, a beacon of warmth in the cold truth of the past. But the warmth couldn't reach the chill that had settled in my bones, the echo of gunshots in a forest that had once been a plain, the stillness of the room. My parents' words hung heavily, a tangible presence amongst the shadows cast by the flickering firelight. The contrast between this peaceful setting and the stark revelation of that day in the woods was jarring. My father cleared his throat, bringing me back from the turmoil of my thoughts. "After we left the woods, your mother and I followed the news closely," he began, his voice tinged with a somberness I had seldom heard from him. It turned out that the man, he had been living in that cabin with his family. He had a breakdown. Things went horribly wrong. The horror of what he implied settled over me like a cold shroud. A family like ours, torn apart by madness and violence in the solitude of the woods. A chill crept up my spine as I imagined the terror they must have experienced. His family. My mother's voice broke as she spoke. "They didn't make it. The police found them after he took his own life." The room seemed to contract, the walls inching closer, as if to contain the enormity of this tragedy. I thought of our own family, how close we had been to that cabin, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding, just a stone's throw away. "And the gunshots?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We heard them," my dad confirmed, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "We heard them, and that's when we knew we had to get out. We didn't know exactly what had happened, but we knew it was bad. We had to protect you and Jody. We had to protect you and Jody." I sat there, struggling to reconcile this dark truth with my cherished childhood memory. The laughter, the games of hide and seek, the sense of adventure, all overshadowed now by the knowledge of what had transpired just beyond our sight. Why now? Why tell me after all these years? The question escaped my lips before I could fully grasp it. "Because you're an adult now," my mother answered softly. "Because we saw how you were drawn to those woods. You've been talking about taking your own family there." The realization hit me like a wave. I had indeed been planning a trip, wanting to share with my own children the joys I thought I had experienced in those very woods. "We didn't want you to go back there, not knowing the truth," my dad added. "The place, it's tainted for us now. We couldn't bear the thought of you and your kids being there, so oblivious." Their intentions, misguided as they may have seemed, were rooted in love and protection. Yet, the revelation left a bitter taste in my mouth. My cherished memory was now a facade, hiding a grim reality. The room felt smaller, the walls imbued with a sense of confinement. I stood up, needing space, needing air. My parents watched me, their eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and apprehension. "I need to understand," I said, more to myself than to them. "I need to see it to make sense of it all." I knew then that I would return to those woods, not to relive a childhood adventure, but to confront the reality that had been hidden from me. The truth had changed everything. The forest of my memories was no longer a place of innocent exploration. It was a scene of a tragedy, a reminder that beneath the veneer of normalcy, darkness could lurk, unseen and unexpected. The drive home from my parents' house was a blur. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was adrift in a sea of turbulent thoughts. The familiar streets seemed alien, as if the revelation had altered not just my perception of that childhood day, but of the world around me. Once home, the silence of my own house was a stark contrast to the usual lively chaos of family life. My wife and kids were visiting her parents for the weekend, a trip I had declined to join because of work commitments. Now, the quiet was oppressive, a physical manifestation of the void that the truth had carved in my heart. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows there morphing into the dense foliage of the woods. My mind replayed the day's conversation, each word from my parents echoing like a distant gunshot. I saw the cabin in my mind's eye, derelict and foreboding, a tomb in the heart of the forest. The next morning, I found myself mechanically going through the motions of my routine. Coffee, breakfast, newspaper. But the words on the page made no sense, the letters jumbling together in a meaningless dance. I left the uneaten breakfast on the table, the cold coffee in the mug, and went outside. The sky was overcast, a blanket of gray that mirrored my mood. I walked aimlessly around the neighborhood, each step taking me further away from reality and deeper into my thoughts. The truth about that day in the woods had tainted more than just a childhood memory. It had cast a shadow over my trust in my parents, my understanding of the past, and my perception of the world as a safe place. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, not from malice, but from love. A love that sought to protect, but in doing so, had built a foundation on lies. I'd built a foundation on lies. I understood their reasoning, but the child in me, the one who had laughed and played in those woods, felt deceived. The impact went beyond personal betrayal. It raised questions about the nature of memory, the ease with which reality could be masked, and the hidden dangers that could lurk in the most benign of places. The forest, once a symbol of freedom and adventure, now represented fear and the unknown. My phone rang, snapping me out of my reverie. It was my wife, her voice a lifeline in the storm of my thoughts. I listened to her talk about their trip, about the kids' antics, but my responses were automatic, my mind still trapped in the shadows of the past. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the decision crystallized in my mind. I needed closure. I needed to confront the past, to see the place where innocence had been lost and nightmares born. "I'm going back to the woods," I whispered to the empty room. It wasn't just a need to understand the physical space where tragedy had unfolded. It was a search for peace, for a way to reconcile the memory of a carefree boy with the reality of a man who had learned that the world was a darker, more complex place than he had ever imagined. The decision brought a sense of purpose, a direction in the midst of chaos. But it also brought a sense of foreboding, a feeling that what I would find in those woods might change me in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. The decision to return to the woods felt like stepping into a cold, swift current, the past pulling me back against the flow of time. I packed a small bag with essentials, a symbolic gesture more than anything. This journey was less about physical preparation and more about mental fortitude. Driving back to the forest, the landscape gradually changed. The urban sprawl gave way to open fields, and then to dense woods. With each mile, my childhood recollections battled with the harsh reality I now knew. The trees that once stood as sentinels of adventure now seemed like silent witnesses to unspeakable horror. I arrived in the late afternoon. The forest, with its towering trees and thick underbrush, looked both familiar and alien. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel under my feet grounding me momentarily. The air in the woods was different, thicker, charged with an energy that I couldn't quite define. As I started down the path, each step felt heavier than the last. Memories flooded back, images of laughter and innocence, interweaved with the shadows of a tragedy I had been blissfully unaware of. The deeper I ventured, the more acute my senses became. The rustling leaves whispered secrets, and the wind carried echoes of a past that refused to remain silent. The path wound its way through the forest, a twisting serpent leading me back to a place I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit. When I finally came upon the cabin, it was just as my memory had painted it, though filtered now through the lens of truth. The structure was dilapidated, the wood weathered and rotting. Windows were broken, the door hung ajar, and nature was reclaiming the land around it. I approached cautiously, half expecting ghosts of the past to materialize in the decaying frame. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. Stepping inside, the first thing that struck me was how ordinary it looked, despite its state of ruin. A chilling reminder that horror doesn't always lurk in dark corners. Sometimes it resides in the mundane. I wandered through the rooms, each step a reverberation through time. I could almost hear the echoes of the family that had lived here, their laughter and their screams intertwined. The walls, now peeling and stained, must have once held memories of happier times before they witnessed the unspeakable. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, a profound sadness enveloped me. Here, in this abandoned cabin, lives had been shattered, and my own childhood innocence had been unknowingly marred. I left the cabin as the last light faded, a sense of closure eluding me. Instead, I felt a deeper connection to the past, a sorrow for those lost and for the boy I once was. The return to the woods hadn't provided answers, but it had offered a poignant understanding of the fragility of life and the shadows that can fall upon it. As I walked back to my car, the forest around me no longer felt threatening. Instead, there was a sense of respect, an acknowledgement of the pain and history it held. The journey back wasn't about confronting a physical place, but about facing the truth and accepting the complexities of life, love, and protection. My partner and I share a deep love for hiking, and last July we embarked on a memorable trip to one of our favorite spots, just west of Shenandoah. This particular location held a special place in our hearts, as it offered solitude, tranquility, and breathtaking views of both Shenandoah and portions of George Washington National Forest to the west. The first day and evening of our trip unfolded as expected, with a sense of peace and quiet, though the stifling humidity made for a somewhat restless night's sleep. The The following morning, we decided to explore a section of Jefferson Forest that we had never ventured into before. It was an area known for its ATV trails and several campsites, boasting an enticing trail leading to an old fire tower, an attraction we had always been eager to explore. The drive to this new destination took us approximately 45 minutes, mostly along winding back roads. Upon our arrival, a peculiar sight immediately caught our attention. The campsites were nearly deserted. The previous evening, we had chosen not to camp here because we had heard that the site was typically packed, and we knew we wouldn't arrive early enough on the weekend to secure a spot. To our surprise, only 2 sites were occupied. One of them displayed a desiccated tent and a scattered mess of garbage, hinting at an extended stay by a previous camper who was conspicuously absent upon our arrival. The other site was occupied by a young woman, likely in her late teens, who was in the process of setting up a compact backpacking tent. The parking area revealed a lone truck and a smaller car. As we began organizing our gear, the young woman approached us with a friendly inquiry about the location of the trailhead. I informed her that we had read the trail branched off, approximately 100 yards into one of the ATV tracks, but confessed we weren't entirely certain which one. Despite the unsettling vibes I was getting from the area, I secretly hoped she would accompany us in our quest to find the trail. However, she simply thanked us and proceeded in the general direction of the trail. We embarked on our hike, exploring several of the ATV trails until we stumbled upon the walking path. Apart from a brief encounter with 2 passing ATVs, we encountered no other hikers, including the young woman we had met earlier. The journey to the mountaintop, where the fire tower stood, took us approximately an hour. The tower itself was a rustic metal structure, its summit accessible via a narrow set of stairs. We reached the top, gazed around, took photographs, but found the view somewhat underwhelming. It was then that an eerie occurrence seized us, plunging us into an unnerving silence. The birds and insects ceased their symphony, and a heavy stillness descended upon the woods. I struggled to articulate the sensation, but it felt as though the ancient soul of the forest was constricting around us, a suffocating presence that left us feeling cornered in spite of the vast expanse around us. My partner and I exchanged wordless glances and immediately made the decision to retreat. We began our descent, fleeing in the direction of our car, yet the oppressive sensation followed us. As we rounded one of the switchbacks, an otherworldly shriek pierced the air, a horrifying blend of metallic screeching and an off-key choir screaming in discord. In that moment, we glimpsed something inexplicable, a colossal entity that appeared massive, despite occupying minimal physical space. It moved in a disorienting dance of writhing shadows and flashes, devoid of color, radiating malevolence and emptiness. My memory fails me, and I can only recall perceiving it for a fleeting fraction of a second before my consciousness surrendered to darkness. When we finally regained our senses, we found ourselves seated in the car, 2 hours having inexplicably passed. An astonishing duration, twice the time it had taken us to ascend the mountain. We were left bewildered, grappling with the disconcerting possibility that we had either lost consciousness or experienced a memory blackout, a phenomenon my partner also endured. The cars that had been parked beside us remained, and the campsite showed no signs of change, with just the same 2 tents as before. The woman we had encountered earlier was absent from her tent, which appeared exactly as she had left it. Thoughts of her weighed heavily on my mind, and I devoted considerable time to investigating whether someone had gone missing around the time of our trip. It took several months for my partner and me to gather the courage to discuss the events of that day. Reading stories shared by others on this platform offered a sense of camaraderie and reassurance, making us feel less isolated in our experience. We still harbor a deep love for hiking, but the Appalachian forests have remained untouched by our footsteps since that fateful day. I wonder if others have encountered similar enigmatic phenomena in these woods, and if they, too, have been left with lingering questions and an enduring sense of awe and dread. I embarked on a unique adventure, loading my bicycle with camping gear and pedaling across the United States for the next 6 months, covering a distance of 4,000 miles. I had a penchant for wild camping, opting for secluded spots in the woods rather than conventional campgrounds. Come late August, I found myself wild camping in the rural expanses of Nebraska, far removed from any town. Venturing into the woods, I set up camp as the last rays of sunlight bathed the landscape. After a simple dinner, a quick teeth-brushing session, and some journal writing, I nestled into my sleeping bag, ready to embrace the night. Over the previous month of camping amidst the trees, I had grown accustomed to the symphony of nocturnal sounds. Crickets chirping, toads croaking, and leaves rustling in the breeze. The distant yips and howls of coyotes were a familiar and comforting nightly occurrence, and I fondly remembered a particular night when 2 owls engaged in a hooting conversation on either side of my tent. However, this particular night in Nebraska proved to be an unsettling departure from the norm. The forest, which usually buzzed with life, was eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even a gentle breeze. The air hung stagnant, and the absence of background noise made every minor sound, like the snapping of twigs, appeared disproportionately loud. Despite having slept in noisy locations during my journey, a night beside busy train tracks, a shared hostel room with a snorer and a sleep talker, nothing compared to the disconcerting stillness of that Nebraska night. It was a silence so profound, so pervasive, that it became the loudest and most haunting sound of my entire 180-day trip. The night in rural Nebraska clung to me like a shadow, an unsettling memory that lingered long after the wheels of my bicycle carried me away. It wasn't merely the absence of sound that haunted me. It was the oppressive stillness that had cast its silent web over the entire forest. In those moments of eerie, quiet fear took root, twisting and growing like the gnarled roots of ancient trees. As I lay in my tent, the usual comfort of nature's lullabies replaced by an unnatural hush, my senses heightened to a point of acute awareness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, became a harbinger of unseen terrors. The familiar sounds that had once been my companions in the night were replaced by a void, a silence so profound it felt as though the very essence of the forest held its breath. At first, I tried to rationalize my fear, convincing myself that it was just an unusual, perhaps even a unique occurrence. Nature, after all, can be capricious, yet the rationalizations were feeble attempts to shroud the unsettling reality. The forest, which had been a sanctuary, had transformed into an alien landscape governed by an unfamiliar, ominous quiet. In the darkness, my mind conjured images of hidden creatures and spectral presences lurking in the shadows. The absence of the usual nighttime orchestra left me vulnerable to the whims of an imagination fueled by the unknown. I questioned whether the silence was a prelude to something more, an anticipation that clung to the air like a heavy mist. To cope, I resorted to a routine that had brought solace throughout my journey: Writing in my journal, the scratch of the pen on paper was a feeble attempt to reclaim a sense of normalcy, a ritual to anchor myself in a reality that seemed to slip further away with each passing moment. I chronicled the quiet, the oppressive stillness, as if by putting it into words, I could distance myself from the visceral fear that gripped me. Sleep remained elusive, and my ears strained for any break in the silence. The snapping of twigs outside the tent became a cacophony, each sound magnified by the absence of background noise. I imagined unseen eyes watching, waiting, and the vulnerability I felt in that moment surpassed any discomfort I had encountered during my months of exploration. As the night wore on, I sought refuge in the feeble glow of my flashlight, scanning the perimeter of the tent for any sign of movement. The moon, a distant observer in the ink, black sky, offered little comfort. In those haunting hours, I longed for the first light of dawn, a beacon to dispel the oppressive darkness and release me from the grip of the silent terror. When morning finally arrived, casting gentle rays of light through the trees, I emerged from my tent with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The forest, now reawakening to the sounds of daybreak, felt like a different realm. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and a breeze whispered through the branches. It was a symphony of life that, in the light of day, banished the memories of the haunting stillness. Pedaling away from that quiet corner of Nebraska, I carried the weight of an experience that transcended the physical. The fear of the quiet had etched itself into my consciousness, a reminder that even in the vast expanses of nature, there are moments when the absence of sound becomes a tangible force, capable of unraveling the threads of familiarity and plunging one into the depths of primal unease. As I continued my journey, the memory of that night became a silent companion, a reminder of the fragility inherent in the dance between human presence and the enigmatic quiet of the natural world.